Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined by Luke Hinds and Craig McLuckie. Craig and Luke, thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks for having us on.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having us, Chris.
Yeah, definitely. I'm excited to chat with you both. I've been following you both for a little bit now. Definitely, I've known Luke a little bit longer than Craig, so I'm excited to dive into your story a bit, Craig, and hear more. But, for folks that don't know you, don't know your background or what you guys recently announced, do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. Luke, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I'm Luke Hinds, and I've been a security engineer, software engineer predominantly for quite a while. But I've done a few different gigs. I've had a bit of time in consultancy services, technical pre-sales, but mostly as a software engineer. And most of my work has been focused on open source. So particularly building open source platforms, security platforms. So I've done various different projects that I've been part of or created myself. And and then recently started Stacklok with my co-founder, Craig, in the secure supply chain space, which I've been involved in for a while with different projects like Sigstore and so forth.
Awesome. Yeah. And hey, I'm Craig McLuckie. I've been in enterprise software for my whole career. Started at Microsoft, back in the late 90s. And I think the kind of highlights of my sort of journey so far have been working at, I joined Google in the very, very early days of cloud there. I was the original product lead for Google Compute Engine, the infrastructure service offering. I worked on that with my friend Joe Beta, and we kind of ideated and created and launched that. It was super fun. We then sort of started thinking about how to be a little disruptive to the industry, how to kind of change the game a little bit, since we were late entrants into the cloud space. So Joe and I and another friend of ours, Brennan, came up with the idea to create this project called Kubernetes, which is an open source system for Linux application container orchestration. I also created the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. I sort of ideated and worked with my friends at Linux Foundation to get that bootstrapped, and a number of other key leaders across the industry. That came together rather nicely. It's become a pretty significant source of open source innovation in the ecosystem. I worked on a few other projects at Google, and then decided to do the entrepreneurial thing and started a little company called Heptio. We were in the business of bridging the gap between open source technologies and enterprise consumption. And that went rather well. And both, so I don't know, fortunately or unfortunately, we were only in business for about 2 years before we were acquired by VMware. And I really enjoyed the opportunity to be part of that journey, where I started, worked with other folks in the organization to start a project called Tanzu, or a commercial effort called Tanzu, which was really an amalgamation of VMware's assets in the cloud native ecosystem that included the acquisition of Pivotal, which was the Cloud Foundry ecosystem, which I ran for a little bit. And then, got to a point where I felt the itch to start something new. And the supply chain space had been something that had been fascinating me for a long time. Long before I met Luke, I'd been obsessing about the opportunity to effectively reason about the transitive closure of dependencies that constitute enterprise software. And had been talking about this even since before the SolarWinds incident happened. But as I started thinking about what was next, I saw this as just being an amazing, both potential challenge to enterprise organizations. As I like to say, software's eaten the world, and now hostile state actors are looking to eat the software industry, unless we do something substantive to address it. So I do see the challenges here, but also the opportunities to do something quite special. So when I met Luke, it seemed obvious that he is a very strong, kind of co-founder, and excited to join the party here.
Yeah, it's safe to say you guys, have done a couple things in the industry. I actually came across Luke originally because I was writing a book about software supply chain, and I was digging into Sigstore quite a bit, and came across Luke, obviously. And then, it's fun to be chatting with you now because I've written extensively and participated in events from CNCF, for example, for you, Craig, and Kubernetes. I think a couple people might have heard of it by now. So I'm excited to chat with you both today. But before we dive into some of those topics, I want to ask you guys, with regard to Stacklok, and looking at the software supply chain space, for example, what kind of gaps do you see that led you guys down this path of, kind of founding this venture? And then what opportunities do you see too? And feel free, either one of you guys can jump in there.
I don't know, Luke, if you want to start, I'm happy to kind of elaborate.
Yes. So without giving up too much away at the moment, because it's early days for us, but I think some of the gaps that really interest us is there's been a hive of activity around generation of bill of materials, so SBOM, provenance statements. There's a lot of people that are generating paper trails around the supply chain, but as yet there's nobody really come up with a good solution to enact some sort of policy or decision based on those manifests that are generated. Okay, so that's something that particularly interests us. Really, is we've done a lot of prior art with projects like Sigstore and Kubernetes, where we can gather multiple data sets around the supply chain. Okay, so all sorts of things such as the dependencies that a project has, its transient dependencies, the build specifics, compiler semantics, build flags, all of these sorts of things. Developers who have worked on a piece of code and introduced a change. Okay, so there's a good sort of a good paper trail around the constitute parts of the supply chain, but yet nobody's really come up with a good way to map that to a workload. Okay, so that's something that we're quite curious and interested in looking at, and multiple other areas really. It's at the moment there is a tsunami of provenance that can be available. Okay, I mean, like you look at Kubernetes, something like 9,000 dependencies and transients, I think it was. And maybe I'm getting confused with React there. Somebody's probably going to lynch me over that. But you get a lot of, I mean, it's a spaghetti monster of ecosystems that are all dependent upon each other, if you see what I mean. And making sense of that, really, making sense of that so that people can make pragmatic, well-informed decisions around their security posture. Craig, you might.
Yeah, I think that's well said, Luke. And there's a couple of things that really stand out for me. And there's a lot of different ways to look at the problem space. I think just summarizing what Luke said, like, hey, SBOMs are great, but what do you do with them? Like how do you make informed decisions? Like, okay, I know what's in here, but like, is it good? Is it bad? Like, not be good today. Is it still good tomorrow? Like, how do I, like, what do I load that into? How do I reason about it? How do I actually manage the mapping of kind of an artifact's, contents to its instance? And how do I sort of, set up the policies to make sure that, if something is discovered, I actually have the opportunity to drive remediation. But I mean, even stepping further back, I think, if you look at the space, and cryptography is lovely. It's solved two problems quite nicely for us. One is, hiding information that you don't want to see, you can't see it without a key. And it's solved the non-repudiation problem. Like, hey, I know that this person is, in fact, the person I'm speaking to is who they say they are based on, some known thing about them. It hasn't necessarily solved the problem of verification. Like take the SolarWinds situation. Should I trust this package because it was published by SolarWinds? Like, well, I trust SolarWinds, so sure. But like, how would I actually verify that? Like, how would I be able to, in the future, look at that and know that that package was built on a system that had a rooted chain of trust to the silicon? How would I know that the sort of farm to table journey of the compiler that was used to generate that code is sort of robust? So, I think the thing that's lovely about, what Luke did with Sigstore and the opportunity here is to really open up and create much more transparency around the software that is driving our industries today. It's an opportunity to look at this public record and to create additional context. As we, well, I can't really claim to be a developer anymore. I used to be one day, long time ago. But as developers are working on a piece of software, they're making decisions. Those decisions could be great decisions, or those decisions might be terrible decisions. But we have no way to know what decisions were being made in that journey towards producing that artifact. And Sigstore is really opening that up. And it's allowing organizations to, developers to start showing their work, creating provenance information that can be published to that public ledger. And then it's going to, over time, make it possible for enterprises to make policy decisions saying, like, I want the developers that produce this thing to have done these things that I know to be best practices. And because that's now part of the public record associated with this binary that I'm consuming, I can feel much better about actually deploying that into a production context where it touches this valuable information. So I think that's the future that we're moving towards. And I think Sigstore is just a wonderful place to start.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I think that, this broader push, like Sigstore and moving beyond that, like we're seeing a push to address like information asymmetry that historically has existed, between software suppliers and consumers. And as you guys point out, having information about what's in the software is great, a great first step, but it's what do you do with it now? We're seeing organizations start to say like, there's a robust set of tools to produce an SBOM, but how do you store it, enrich it, ingest it, make sense of it for vulnerability management purposes and so on. And then now we're seeing a lot of focus on things like exploitability or reachability, trying to make some context from the noise. Any thoughts around, that ecosystem that's emerging of, you talked about developers, for example. I'm seeing a push to enable and empower developers to make, more risk-informed consumption and use of open source, for example. I'm curious your guys' thoughts on that front.
Yeah, so it raises an interesting aspect here. So really, the way I look at this game, it's typically been point in time based. Okay, so what I mean by that is at a particular juncture, a CVE is reported. Okay, and then it's deemed to have been in a code base at a particular time. Okay, and then a particular release is cut from that code base. Okay, and once that's left gate, so to say, once that's shipped, there's a lack of insight into where that is and how exploitable it is. Okay, and the current approach really is vulnerability scanning. So effectively, there's a black box. You'll throw loads of things at it to try and discover what's in there, and then it will tell you if you have, so many criticals, so many different grades of CVEs. Okay, and so if we, and I say we because this, it takes a village. This is beyond just one small startup. If we can get this right, vulnerability scanners will be a thing of the past because you'll know precisely what is within any given deployed artifact. If you see what I mean, you have that credible, rich, cryptographically based provenance to be able to establish that. But around the exploitability, that is where it gets really interesting then, because you can obviously have a scenario where I might be using a widgets library in my code. Okay, and then I happen to be using, I don't know, some XML canonicalization part of that library. But that library also has another function that spawns a raw networking socket. Okay, but I'm not using that. But that socket there's some denial of service attack that's been discovered, and it's got a critical CVE. Everybody's losing their minds over it. So I immediately get tagged as having a critical in my code. But obviously I'm not using that. Do you see what I mean? So you have the kind of you come along to this thing of contextual awareness as opposed to point of view awareness, if you see what I mean. And then it goes further from that, where you have, we have this scenario of this widgets library and a canonicalization framework and a socket. I could be deploying that to a Lambda function where I can't create my own socket. I'm reliant upon a REST API that AWS will provide. So there's all these contextual elements, and that's definitely something that we want to look at cracking. There are various efforts that are underway. I think some of the problems really are reliance upon humans to give a statement as to how something exploitable is. Okay. With commercial vendors, they can always be strong-armed by a customer to provide that information, and they can be held accountable financially. It gets a lot more tricky, I think, for open source communities, because then you're reliant upon somebody doing that, of their own accord, because they believe it's a good thing to do. So that's where it gets a little more tricky as to how that occurs. So we're very curious to look at how can we do this in an automated way. How can we do this due diligence around the exploitability of what you're using within a software component, and then where you're deploying that. Do you see it all? In what sort of APIs are you calling? What environment are you running this in? An EC2 bucket, a Lambda function, a container? a bare metal machine with its own sort of hardware interfaces. And so that's something that's definitely we are keen to have a stab at that area very much.
Yeah, and exactly what Luke said. I think like one of the key challenges we face in the security industry is there's no tolerance for false negatives, right? Like there's an expectation that security protocols generate lots of false positives potentially, but there's no tolerance for false negatives. And as a result of that, you get this deluge, this overwhelming, sort of set of potential vulnerabilities that you have to investigate and put to rest. And obviously the potential here is dramatic, which is being able to effectively prioritize the set of things that you care about based on reachability. Like, is this thing even reachable? Is this even loaded into memory? Is this whatever? And I think, heading in that direction, and we're seeing a lot of interesting innovation in this ecosystem that's really driving in that direction. A lot of different security vendors are producing capabilities that let you understand the reachability of a vulnerability. The thing that we need to do as a community is come together and establish a normalized protocol or a normalized API or a normalized interface so that we can start to reason about this, so that the vendors that are operating in the sort of runtime security space can use all of their fascinating proprietary technology to mark up, like, hey, this is precisely what's operating in your working set. This is precisely what's available. And then, folks that are on the other side, on the sort of production side, can then start to reason about, mapping, context that's coming through the supply chain into that environment. So you can actually do the production pairing of, what packages are involved and what's reachable. And so, like, I would love to see this community really rally around an open apparatus for managing that.
Yeah, as you guys have mentioned, there's been tremendous traction. I focus on the federal space because that's where I work a lot, with the Cybersecurity Executive Order and obviously publications from CISA and NIST and NSA and other organizations. We've seen industry do the same from CNCF and CIS, and there's a robust set of information out there. I'm curious, when we look at all the momentum we see here in the industry, do we think we're heading in the right direction? And also, how do organizations start to make some sense? Because there is so many, different recommendations, best practices, guidance, publications, et cetera, coming out. If you're an organization just starting to get your hand around software supply chain security, how do you recommend even starting there?
I mean, I can sort of provide some initial thoughts. I think, broadly, yes and no, like with everything. Yeah, I mean, with like the level of energy and the level of attention that's being received by these problems is positive. I think it's good that EO 14028 or whatever the executive order number was that was issued has certainly driven a tremendous amount of attention to this. I think the real danger here is a little bit of cargo culting, right? Like where, hey, I have an SBOM, I'm fine. Like, no, you're not. Like it hasn't changed anything. It's just like you can have, like you have an index of everything that's been produced, but unless you have that system that you can then load that into and reason about, we live in this world where content is effectively passed by value, not by reference. If you're sort of thinking about programming, right? Like you see this instance of something, it's static, you treat it like a static thing, you scan the heck out of it. So I scanned it at a point in time, but I haven't necessarily preserved all of the awareness that's generated out of scanning that thing or loading the SBOM or doing whatever. And so we need to hold that reference. We need to know where this came from. We need to know what the constituent pieces are. We need to maintain the map of where that artifact is deployed into a set of instances. And only then will we as an industry be positioned to have a proactive approach to security remediation versus the current reactive model where, you have to like look at what happened with, something as simple as Log4j. I mean, I say simple. I mean, obviously, no exploit is necessarily simple. But I mean, some public agencies reported 33,000 human hours dealing with mitigations. I talked to a lot of CIOs and CISOs at large organizations like banks, and they're like, we still see these instances showing up in production. Like, how's this even possible? We run a mono repo. Like we've worked this out, and there's just so little control over how folks are managing those the sort of dependency chains that we have a lot of work to do. So I think the energy is good. I think the danger here is that we get into this kind of world where it's very like TSA security, where someone once did something, and so we make every traveler forever off to take their shoes off, where the practical kind of risks may actually be in a slightly different domain, but the only tools that we have to drive positive change are so coarse-grained that they sort of force us into space where we're not able to learn as an industry and really evolve. I'd love to hear Luke's perspective. He's probably much smarter on this than I am.
Yeah, no, it's just something I wanted to add around the meeting customers where they are. What can they do? And I mean, that's really interesting because it's such a varied landscape at the moment. You have some folks that are working, in a kind of a modern approach. They've got a modern approach to software. So they use an automation, CI. They're aware of container technologies. They maybe got some engineers that turn up to Sigstore or the OpenSSF, and they're fairly well advanced. You see, some folks out there, their CI it's a group of Perl scripts. Do you see what I mean? And there's some nasty stuff happening. They're very much way at the back. Do you see what I mean? So it's a whole spectrum of people in different places. So that's where it's sort of quite hard to give general advice, because it's such a varied audience. Some folks are obviously much more advanced than others, and it's the others that are a concern, really, where they've got these very sort of old antiquated approaches to software development, and they're typically the ones that are exploited as well, as we see quite so often.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. There's a spectrum of maturity within the organizational ecosystem. Basically, when we look at the ecosystem, and not all organizations are going to be at the same place. And I think we'll see some standardization in some industries. For example, the federal space, where you have a set of requirements that every organization has to codify and rally around. But in the broader ecosystem, it's going to vary wildly. And I think even organizations' ability to attest to those requirements in the federal space is going to vary wildly as well, based on their maturity and expertise. Sure. Another ecosystem that's really diverse that you guys have both spoke on, Luke in the Sigstore context, and then Craig on the Kubernetes front and CNCF, for example, is open source software. And we've seen a tremendous amount of adoption of open source software. But as Luke points out, there's challenges there with just identifying where components are. 33,000 hours spent for one federal agency is cited in the CSRB report that I linked here. And then also, organizations continue to re-download vulnerable versions of components, even after they maybe have remediated them from the environment. I wanted to say, when we look at the open source software ecosystem, there's tremendous opportunity there in terms of speed to market, innovation, the robust community that we have. But it is a spectrum where we have known vulnerabilities or, lack of maintenance and support for certain projects. I've been writing and talking a lot lately. I think it's, 25% of projects have one maintainer and 94% of projects have less than 10. So for every Kubernetes, there's probably thousands of projects that, don't have that level of support or expertise, for example. When you look at the open source software ecosystem, how do you start to reason about that in terms of, leveling up the security? And then also there's the challenge that, it's kind of provided as is. You can't really levy these requirements onto these entities because they're doing this on their own free will. So I'm curious your guys' thoughts on that front.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things here that I think are really important. One is developers are making decisions every day. Like I have a lot of again, I'm not a developer. I 20 years ago, sure. But if I were a developer and I were looking at my sort of work, there's a variety of different choices. Like there's always some cool new node library available. The world of front end JavaScript is changing so quickly. There's always some cool new widgetry out there. How do I know whether that widgetry is provided by two state hackers approving each other's PRs that have worked their way into a community or not? I don't. There's no practical way to do that, right? But what we can do is start to provide a lot. We can provide what heuristics, like getting to the point where those decisions are being contextualized for developers at the point of check-in, like at the point of integration, like at the point of hey, I've got this new merge request that includes some new library. Can I at least contextualize that? So you have to meet developers where they are, which is at the point of time where they're sort of making these decisions. So we have to shift left this decision making as far as possible and help contextualize that. So I think there's a lot of really rich context that Sigstore is generating right now. So we could help people figure out, like, hey, typo squatting, you probably shouldn't use that package, it's bad. And as additional context is being published, as we start to have an opportunity to generate heuristics, that then needs to be provided to developers. And there's a lot of questions around things like AIML. What role does AIML play in this ecosystem? I'm sure we'll have a chance to get into it, but at some point we could start to look at generating heuristics around some of these these dependencies, and looking at a community and being basically saying, hey, this these are the heuristics associated with this. This community has established a set of practices that we think are appropriate. Potentially some of those heuristics could be AIML generated, but more likely just having the community self-report. Like as we start to look at Sigstore's adoption, having the community self-report, like, these are the sort of the merge patterns that the community is using. This is the branch protections. This is the set of kind of 101s that a community has adopted. If those 101s can then be published as provenance information that can then be consumed downstream, you've created far more transparency, and people are just able to make much better decisions. So this is where, again, coming back to Sigstore, that there's what Sigstore is now. There's the context that Sigstore has made available now, which is powerful. But if we can find ways for individuals to show they're working a little bit more and continue to publish richer and richer provenance information and attestations, getting to the point where eventually I can look at something and be like, this community is healthy. I know this because of all these attestations, like all of these, like they're operating at salsa level, blah. They're, they have, a lot of, controls and practices in place. And those are written, demonstrably into a cryptographically secure destination that's tamper resistant. So I trust this. I can trust this community. And once we get there, we're going to be in much better shape. And then, maybe AML will generate some really rich additional heuristics, and there's a lot of applicability there too.
Yeah. So I want to ask you, go ahead, Luke. I had a follow-up question, but go ahead, Luke. I'll jump in a second.
Yeah, so I was just going to add to that. And I mean, there is some really good weights out there that we can leverage already, that can provide really good protection. So, as a cherry on top of to what Craig just outlined there, I mean, a lot of the times, just stepping off the gas and waiting 5 days for a release to hit can get you an amazing amount of protections, especially when you look at protestware. Okay, so somebody hijacks their own node package to sort of spam a load of stuff to stand it out, or perform some sort of destructive action, if you see what I mean. So just by kind of stepping off 5 days from releases, you can get protected from the herd. Then you're not on the edge of the herd where the lion is, if you see what I mean. And so there's lots of sort of very good pragmatic controls that you can leverage. I mean, the really good work that the scorecards folks have done that can be leveraged as a very good signal around how robust and the security posture of an open source project is. Do they have a means for somebody to report vulnerabilities? Are there certain controls that community's put in place, and so forth?
Yeah, I wanted to ask I was going to ask a follow-up question to some of the comments Craig made, and I know, Luke, you have some strong opinions on this topic, but another thing that we've seen a tremendous amount of attention around lately is artificial intelligence, obviously AI, and we've seen, when I was at RSA, I feel like every vendor on the floor had an AI capability that they were marketing. From everything from threat intelligence, vulnerability prioritization, writing more secure code, like the use cases were endless. And at the same time, we've seen a lot of FUD around malicious actors using it for various purposes. And even, lately, I think I saw something this week saying it could lead to an extinction event. So, we seem to have the broadest spectrum of AI, promise and perils. I'm curious your guys' thoughts on, where do you see AI going? You think we'll leverage it as a community to do more good than nefarious actors can leverage it to do bad? Is it a lot of marketing hype right now? Where do you think we are, and where are we headed?
Okay, good question. So it's definitely it's an exciting area. It really is. So if we've ever appeared skeptical, we have our reasons to be, but we've got reasons to be excited as well. Around what this can do. I guess, the first thing really is, with security, there's no shades of grey. Do you see what I mean? When we look at, kind of, the damage that a reverse false positive can do effectively. So there's no ambiguity in security. And if you look at AI at the moment, there is ambiguity. AI can hallucinate, it can get things wrong. Okay. And so it's more suggestive, really. So currently, AI in its current guise is, without other mechanisms to provide some sort of arbiter around how credible is the output that AI, that generative model has produced. It's a dangerous area, really, because if you're making security decisions on something that can get something wrong, but you're assuming it's an authority, I think that's one of the problems. So, especially for a lot of folks, I think, in the gold rush, a lot of people have just been shell wrapping around Open API. So they're just piping in prompts and then getting a return back and presenting it to the user and saying, hey, what do you think? And then the user is, the responsibility is deferred to them, if you see what I mean. They have to sort of act as the judge as to the quality of the information. So, but we are at the same time very excited about this, especially around, the things that we discussed earlier, like how exploitable is something when there's this magnitude of contextual data points, and I'm sure AI can really start to perhaps look at that and, and assist in that sort of area.
Yeah, I mean, the world changed with the introduction of generative AI, and I think anyone who tells you they know what's going to happen is probably selling something. Like, we don't. Like, we're all trying to figure it out together. It is a powerful tool. Like, I mean, on the flip side, and I don't mean to be like, I'm not sure that this is like an extinction level event that's just, rolling out. Like, I don't know. Like, I don't think anyone does. But if you look at the risks associated with things like phishing, and you look at the tools that the bad actors now have, like, they just got superpowers. Like, you can stand up a website with no effort at all, just using one of these agents that looks exactly like another website. It's free to do. You could emulate my voice, and I'm sure people will. I'm sure employees, like, I'm going to have my employees have safe words, because I could call them and tell them to do something, and it's not me, right? So, like, the world got more dangerous. There's no question about that. And we don't know yet what that means. We don't know how malicious actors are going to use it. We don't know whether it's going to give us superpowers to mitigate. I can say that, certainly, Luke and I spend at least half our time talking about this. We are, and like our MO is to take this to the community. These conversations are happening in the community, like as we speak. And we want to make sure that whatever we come up with is a community-friendly, community-centric, way to kind of bring these technologies to bear in a constructive manner, and also to mitigate some of the risks. I think the other element of this, and sorry, I don't mean to heap more uncertainty on uncertainty, but we also need to think about the AI models themselves and how those might be attacked. If you think about the world with code generation, Autopilot's a fabulous tool. Like, you basically tab complete your way through project generation. Developers now have superpowers. The number of developers that are going to be producing high quality content is going to go up and up and up and up. It's opening up new worlds to citizen coders who didn't necessarily historically have the tools to generate something useful, but they now can unlock real code using these technologies. We also need to look at, like, how do we protect the training sets? How do we make sure that the hackers aren't getting malicious code injected into these types of domains directly? So it's all wide open, and it's fascinating, and it's consuming an inordinate amount of our time and attention. And I think that's right. I think this is probably one of the biggest disruptive moments we've seen in a long time. This is definitely an iPhone moment, perhaps even bigger than that. Yeah. And we just are still, fastidiously working out what that means. And as Luke said, like, I always joke, like, horseshoe and hand grenades. But, like, security is not a close enough game. You need to be right on. And AI is still, very much in the sort of directionally interesting, but not necessarily, precise space.
Yeah, I think you're both spot on. It's really interesting to watch its introduction and evolution, and now we're kind of at a, I don't want to say an arms race, but between malicious actors on adopting it for nefarious purposes and us as a community using it for, for good and for the right reasons. So it's going to be interesting to keep watching it evolve and unfold. So, we cover a lot of ground, from everything from open source software supply chain security, AI, and so on. For folks that, want to find out more about you all and Stacklok and what you're up to, where can they find you guys? Where can they learn more?
Would be great if folks would visit stacklok.com, our website, stacklok.com. Both Luke and I are on Twitter, LinkedIn, Blue Sky. So definitely kind of hit us up. We'd love to hear from you. And if you go to our website and submit a form, we'd love to be in touch. So thank you for dialing in and connecting with us.
Yeah, definitely happy to have you guys on. I hope everyone enjoyed the conversation and have a good afternoon. That'll take us out. Thanks.
Thank you so much.